Well, if you are in Kids Connection 4 and 5, Miss Jan and Mr. Mike and the whole crew, hold on, Elijah, don't go busting out that door till Miss Jan gets there for me. There we go. They are ready to rock and roll. I got to tell you, if you're ever just interested, some people have said, hey, do you guys have a choir at HCC? I said, well, anybody's more than welcome to come and sing and be a part, and you got to just, connect with Aaron and find out. They'll get you on we have this planning center thing, and so if you play an instrument or sing and that's an interest of you, feel free to do that. But secondly, if you're wondering if we have a choir, all you need to do is you need to come sit right down here in the front, because I have this entire angelic choir that sits beside me, and it is the most beautiful thing to hear those girls just singing and just pouring their hearts out to Jesus. So I invite you to come on down next week and come sit with me. I found an iPod. I believe it was after Christmas Eve. It was in the back area, so there were kids everywhere Christmas Eve. If you were here, we tried a little experiment we're going to rework for next Christmas Eve in that process, but we had kids kind of everywhere. But if you lost an iPod, and you can describe that for me, it's not a phone, it's an actual iPod, I would gladly return that to you. Otherwise, I appreciate your donation. So, no, I'm just kidding. But we'll auction it off to the highest bidder or something like that. But I have it if you're looking for it. So let me just say this. Happy New Year. We've had a blast this last month, sort of just celebrating the birthday of Jesus, and what a sweet Christmas season, gathering Christmas Eve, candlelight, singing happy birthday to Jesus, having families share their stories of Christmas, celebrating communion together was just an awesome way to just kind of wrap up the Christmas season. Then last Sunday was a blast. I want to thank you so much for those of you that were here and that have poured out your love. I know in talking with Aaron and Stephanie afterward last weekend, they said, we literally felt instantly like we were a part of a family. And so we live in Kenya, and it was the first time we had ever walked into your community. And so I love that about who you are and how that allows people to feel literally a part of a family. Last week we talked a lot about going, didn't we? And what does it look like, whether it's to Kenya or to remind you about the next trip to go is here in 2 weeks as we head to Mexico across the border to go do some construction at the camp with George and Jan. And you're more than welcome to go with us. Do you have to have skills? Not at all. We'll have some skilled laborers that are directing those of us that are unskilled laborers. And you notice I said us that are unskilled laborers because I am a pack mule, but I am not one of the skilled laborers. I often create more problems than I help. And so they have me go get food and do stuff like that a lot of times. But it'll be great. We're going to reset some door frames, paint some walls, put up some ceiling fans. It'll just be an awesome time. If your kids are 5 and older, you can bring them with you. The cost is $75. We had 20 total spaces. We have about 6 of those or so, 7 of those that are left at this point. So if you're kind of still on the fence, we really need to know whether you're coming, because we're trying to prioritize how many projects we can actually get finished on the other side. Some people have said, well, is it safe? And all I can tell you is this, right? I've been, because I knew it was Mexico. I knew there was some resistance a little bit, like, hey, man, we're going across the border. So I said, okay, great, I'll go. I went all over the place. Don't ask me where I went, because I couldn't tell you, because the roads don't have street signs. So you're just driving on dirt roads, But we went all over the place, saw 4 different churches, the camp, the whole 9 yards. I thought, okay. I came back, took a couple of our elders with me. I'm like, fellas, am I missing something? Because it seems just like San Antonio to me, except we're on paved roads that have holes in them, right? And so they were like, yeah, I'm not seeing anything you're not seeing. So I sent my own child without reader eye. Can I tell you it's guaranteed safe? I can't tell you it's guaranteed safe here. But it's safe enough for me to say, hey, Sarah, you're more than welcome to go down and be a part of what's happening on the other side without me. And that's the best endorsement I can give it from a safety perspective. So if it's still a hesitancy for you, that's great. We got a team going to Argentina later this year. You're more than welcome to go with Richard and Ann. And there'll be lots of opportunities to do that, to go. But remember, man, get that passport. Get ready to go. Start asking God, hey, when am I going? What does it look like in the next 3 years? Those of you with little kids, you got to start planning. I'm just telling you, I had them. And if we don't plan, if we don't say intentionally, hey, I'm going in this summer or this season, this spring break, this break, then it won't happen. We'll just kind of keep moving. So this morning we're going to kick off a brand new series through the life and the lens of Paul's epistle and Paul's letter to his young student named Timothy. Now, as we do that, I do want to just acknowledge Christmas break has been great. Some of you guys have had a chance to travel. Some people are still traveling. They came dressed as blue seats this morning. But they're still traveling with families. For some, it's a time of rest and renewal, I hope. And this last week was New Year's. And so some people take New Year's and they start to look back a little bit over the previous year. And it sort of swells up kind of both good and bad emotions, at least in my world, right? I can see some seasons where, man, I was really successful and some things happened that we desired to see happen, and so we celebrate those. And then I see some other seasons where I either fell short of my own or someone else's expectations and came up a little short, and we're pretty good at looking backwards. Right? All throughout history, we're pretty good at reading the history book. What we're not all that good at is predicting the future. Right? Did you know, by the way, this is free of charge, but in 1967, they predicted that technology by the turn of the century would take over the workload, and that the average American would only work 22 hours a week, and we would only work 27 weeks a year. That would have been 15 years ago at 2000. Now, I don't know about your world, but they missed the mark in mine. Right? In fact, we seem extremely busy, in a hurry everywhere. We talk fast. We eat fast. We even gather together with friends, and we have our own saying. I hate to eat and run, but I got to eat and run. I got to get to the next thing. And my question, as we start to think about God penning a new chapter in 2015, is are we really willing to let him pen the same chapter again? 361 days from now, when we look back on 2015, are we going to look back full of joy? Or are we going to look back full of regret? And I wish it had been different. You know, are we going to be as busy in 2015 as we were in 2014? And hear me, I'm not saying all busyness is bad. But I told our team earlier, I'm convinced that one of Satan's greatest tools is busyness. Even busy doing some good things. Because we can miss the best things along the way. So as you stop and sort of pause, and I don't think there's anything wrong with setting some time to go, hey, God, what did you do last year? And where do I think you're headed this year? And we definitely want to leave him some room, right, to call a mulligan and to navigate along the way. But we make these New Year's resolutions oftentimes, and I'm kind of baffled by those, by the way. Did you know 92% of us never fulfill them? By the end of January, 45% of them are shot. Right? And yet we kind of seem to just keep doing it over and over. And so I love Dr. David Cook. He's a famous sports psychologist, a mental coach, and he was talking to the Baylor women's golf team recently. And he said to them, he said, hey, what happens in golf many times is you girls will lose an entire round of golf and have a terrible score because of one hole or two. See, in golf, there's kind of two nines. Typically, if you're not a golfer, there's a front nine and a back nine. You play 18 total holes. The clubhouse is in the middle. And so we kind of call this the turn, where we're turning from one nine to the other. We have one bad hole, and we give up on the entire front nine. We're like, oh, well, the rest of them are shot, and I'll just wait till I make the turn, and I can have a better back nine. And Dr. Cook says to the Baylor girls, he says, what if you girls decided to play 6 rounds of 3? Or what if instead you decided to play 9 rounds of 2? And any one bad hole you have, okay, great, I'm going to have this whole round's done, and one hole later, you're starting a new round again. And I wonder what it would look like if we looked at the next year with the same kind of lens. Instead of saying, hey, what are we going to do in 2015? What would it look like to play 12 rounds next year, and what are we going to do in January? What do you think God's doing in our world in January? Maybe we play 52 rounds and just do it a week at a time along the way, and start to say, God, what is it you're doing as your shepherd and as your pastor? I got to tell you, my prayer is that some of that includes, man, what is God doing in us personally and individually? And what are we going to do this next year as a part of that? Maybe we decide, hey, for the month of January, we're going to spend 5 minutes together a week as a family. We're going to read one chapter of 1 Timothy, because that's what we're going to walk through. And let's try it for January and see how it goes. Maybe our family's going to decide 3 to 4 to maybe we'll stretch it and go 5 times a week. We'll sit down as a family and have a devotion and read some chunk, a verse, 2 verses, 3 verses, a chapter of God's Word, depending on how old our kids are, and pray together. Maybe we decide, you know what, I'm going to get in a connection group this year and connect with God and some other people. That might be a couples thing. That might be some ladies connecting together, some guys connecting together. I don't know what that looks like for you. But maybe we make that decision. Let's just try it in January. I don't know about all of 2015. Let me try it for a month. See how it goes. Maybe we decide in January as a family, we're going to do a community ministry and be God's hands and feet in an intentional way somewhere. Maybe Mexico. Or maybe you adopt a single mom in your neighborhood or at the school where your kids go to school. Or an elderly couple. And as a family, however many people that is for you in your home, you're going to decide, you know what, we're going to take them lunch or dinner once a week and just go love on them. Or we're going to go pick up the leaves that fall this time of year because the elderly couple can't get out and do that without breaking a hip. I don't know what it looks like for you, but what if instead of planning in 2015, we just say, let's just start with January. And we'll re-go again in February. And we'll do that as a result of what we see God do in January. And I think when we pause and look back and flip the calendar into 2016, it could be pretty incredible when we look back through the history books at what we see God do in and through our lives. So that has nothing to do with 1 Timothy. It's totally free of charge, so I won't charge you for that one. But let me pray, and then we're going to dive into Paul's letter here. So, Father, we come to you this morning so thankful for the story of Christmas that we were able to celebrate together as a community. God, we're just so excited for fresh starts and new beginnings. And new years, at least in our culture, seem to allow the perfect time for you to breathe a fresh breath of new life into our lives. So, God, we're praying for incredible things in your church in 2015. And we're praying that those around us would see you doing amazing work in our lives. That we recognize, Father, our time is limited. In 361 days from now, we turn the year to another year in the calendar. God, will we make the most of every opportunity? Help us to understand who we are in you and how that overflows into our lives every single day. In the precious name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Like I said, we're going to dive into Paul's letter to Timothy. And here's what we wanted to do this morning. Was we want to set the framework. Right? So I want to give you a lot of history and a lot of background this morning to try to help you see and discover this relationship that Paul and Timothy had. So Paul was the author. Timothy was his young student. We're going to see him bring him up. And there's some language that Paul uses with Timothy that if we don't understand the relationship that they had, it's going to be difficult to read. But we're going to see Paul challenge Timothy on some things and call Timothy to some places that, to be honest, probably aside from our wife and our best friend, maybe a parent if we're a kid, there's not very many people that have the authority to speak into our lives with the authority that Paul speaks to Timothy sometimes. So we wanted to take a moment and say, hey, let's spend today giving you the history, giving you the background, and then next week we're going to dive into chapter 1, which is huge. It has some incredible meat. I don't know how I'm going to get through all of chapter 1 in 1 week, but we're going to figure that out this week as we start to chop some pieces together. But this week is all about the background, and here's why. I know from coaching Sarah, and all these girls that I get to coach all year long, it's huge, right, to encourage them, to motivate them, to push them to be their very best. But it is critical, uber critical, and this is hard for me because I love to push, and it's hard to me working with a bunch of girls, but it's uber critical that I never break their spirit. Man, I'm called to push them. I'm called to challenge them. I'm called to take us to a place we didn't think we could go, but I can't break their spirit. If I ever crush their spirit along the way, I lose. And that's sort of what we see in this letter that Paul writes to Timothy. Now, Paul writes 3 letters that we call pastoral epistles. So 3 of Paul's 13 letters in the New Testament, he wrote to pastors, 1st and 2nd Timothy and the book of Titus. We think 1 Timothy was written somewhere at the very end of Paul's ministry, somewhere around 62 to 67 AD, give or take a little bit, somewhere in that process at the end of his ministry. But if you back up from where he wrote 1 Timothy back to about AD 50, Paul's in his 2nd missionary journey. So he took 3. He's in his 2nd missionary journey to the city of Lystra. And the book of Acts in 16:1 says this, right? This is our introduction. Paul came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, whose father was Greek. Right now, Lystra is a town today, if you wanted to find it, it's located in modern Turkey. Sort of sits up on a hillside outside the province of Galatia. Back in AD 6, under the Roman leadership of Augustus, they took Lystra and they said, hey, part of your responsibility, we're making you a Roman colony, and part of your role is to guard down below the province of Galatia. And so they've had this military sort of upbringing in their culture, but they also had this really rocky sort of farmer kind of terrain, just totally off the record. The rocky terrain would have been perfect for Paul's first trip there. When he and Barnabas were there and planting the church to start with, doing incredible ministry. In fact, the people there wanted to worship Paul and Barnabas. And then Paul heals the man that's lame, and instantly the tide switches, And what do? They start picking up the rocky terrain, and literally, in the blink of an eye, they stone Paul and drag him to the edge of town, leaving him thinking he's dead right outside of town. So that's sort of the terrain. Paul's actually going back there, right, which is crazy to me. Right, you throw rocks at me here, by the way, I won't be here next Sunday. But he's going back to the city, and now he's in his second trip back, in his second missionary journey. It's AD 50, and they begin this relationship. Paul is no doubt coaching Timothy. Hey, this culture has got soldiers in it. Right? These guys have been defending the province of Galatia, and this culture is farmers. And so as you write, and as you lead, and as you shepherd, understand the culture that you're working in. And Paul's first responsibility to Timothy, right? You guys are going to love this. They didn't put him on the setup team. Right? They didn't say, hey, would you go down and work with kids for a few weeks? Timothy's first job is the evangelist. Right? I mean, picture that. You walk in the door, and what we do, we hand you a microphone and say, hey, would you preach this week? I mean, that's his first role. Now, Paul, no doubt, was the headliner. Paul was the guy who brought the crowd. He was the one that had the relationship. He was the one, no doubt, that was more famous. But Timothy's first role in the church was to preach, and because Paul gave it to him, it gave him instant credibility. Timothy instantly had a voice that people would listen to. So here in Acts 16:1, this is the first connection that we see between Paul and Timothy. Now you read there again. Let me read it again. Paul came to Derbe and Lystra, and a disciple named Timothy, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, but his father was Greek. Now, all throughout the trip, we sort of see this relationship between Paul and Timothy began to develop. Almost, to be honest, and we see it several times. We'll see it next week in 1 Timothy 1:2. We see it in Corinthians. We see it in 2 Timothy. Paul sort of talks to Timothy in a father-son relationship. Several times. We'll see one of those verses here in just a minute. He actually refers to him almost as his child, as his son. We know his mother and his grandmother were both Jewish followers of Jesus. So his mother Eunice and his grandmother Lois, they were believers. But his dad says right there in 16:1, he was Greek. Hey, this is going to come into play. We'll see it a little bit in a minute. Bless you. We'll see it just a little bit in a minute. But we're going to see it huge in a couple of weeks. This has a pretty powerful significance for Timothy, that his dad was Greek, actually literally translated as a Hellenist. Now, if you were going to be Greek, Hellenist probably be the one most of us would sign up for. That was the very high-class, influential class in their culture in his day. So we instantly know that Timothy probably grew up in a nice home. Timothy was probably afforded a premium education along the way. And based off what we read in Acts 16, there's actually, we know very little about his dad, and we actually almost get the impression that his dad was no longer living, that his dad was gone. And so Paul steps in and begins to almost play this parental sort of role, and because they were, wealthy is probably the best word to use. We see Paul use a language in 2 Timothy. He's talking to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:20. He says, now in a wealthy home, there are not only gold and silver vessels, but there's also ones made of wood and clay. Some are for honorable use, others are for ignoble use. Right? We don't see Paul anywhere else in all 13 letters refer to the church in this sort of language. We really think Paul's trying to speak a language. Hey, Timothy, this is your world. You're growing up in that kind of culture. Let me begin to help you understand. And he begins to have this really, really powerful paternal kind of role in Timothy's life. Whether his dad was living or absent, we don't know which. But we know Paul began to fill that role. And I wonder how often men, we actually consider the power and the value of our influence in another young man or young woman's life. What I love about this picture that Paul paints, and we're getting ready to see an unbelievable picture over the next 7 weeks of a man who almost fills the role of a dad who isn't flesh and blood. We are seeing the epidemic in our culture. Right? Some of you guys are school teachers. You could stand up here and give testimony after testimony of the epidemic that's in our culture. Did you know that children without fathers comprise 63% of youth suicides, 5 times the national average? Those taking their own life have no father, no paternal influence in their life. Kids without fathers are 90% of the homeless and incarcerated children that are out there. Children that don't have a parental father influence in their life. 71% of all high school dropouts had no male figure influence in their life. You flip the page over and go, hey, well, what about kids that do? You ready? They're 40% less likely to ever repeat a grade in school. Ever. Right? They're 70% less likely to ever drop out of school. They're way more likely, the percentage was huge, to actually make A's in school. And it kind of challenged me. I thought, I wonder how often, and I sit with couples all the time as we're doing counseling, and I look at the men and say, understand one thing, our kids' love tank is your responsibility. And they look at me like I'm crazy. Well, what about her? I don't know what it is about mom. Mom kind of just have it, and they pour it out all the time, and it kind of keeps the kids above float, barely above E sometimes, but from E up is all men. And I can't tell you why. I can just tell you from rep after rep after rep after rep after rep, it's truth. Man, it's our job. And so some of us aren't even married. What does it look like for us to go mentor some young kindergartner or first grader at a school? And just say, you know what, you'll be my Timothy. And I'm going to go pour my life into you as Paul poured his life into Timothy. And for you, it's going to cost me time and energy and money, and it's rarely going to be convenient. But if it makes that big a difference in someone's life, Paul paints a pretty sweet picture that we're going to see the power that can have. For those of us that have our own kids, dads, and I say us, I'm calling us on the carpet. Are we filling our role along the way? So as we open up Timothy, I love it. There's all kinds of organization to the church. So let me just kind of give you a highlight of where we're headed. Some of these are going to be really fun to unpack. Some of them I'm glad I'm not teaching that weekend when we get there. But next week, we're going to how do you deal with the law? What does the law look like? This law of religion, and how is the church supposed to respond? And we see Timothy's role in that. We're going to see all sorts of guidance for corporate worship. How do we stay away from false doctrine? We're going to see how do you organize the church? What is conduct supposed to be like for those of us that are inside the community of faith? There's instructions for public worship. How do we pray? What does that look like? What's proper? What's not proper? Those kinds of things. How about this one? What is the role of men and women in the church? Yeah. Good luck with that one. No, I'm just kidding. I don't think you have that week. I think yeah. So we're going to have all kinds of fun. Church leadership, elders, deacons. How do you guard the truth within the confines of the church? How do we deal with different groups? All of this. Paul's writing this pastoral epistle to Timothy. Hey, let me help you make sure that as you set your foundation for the church, you find the right frame and the right function so that it can be the most successful. But then he gets really personal at the end. And he really challenges Timothy on pursuing holiness. And that's where we're going to have to know the kind of relationship they had. And he pushes him hard, not to break his spirit, but to push him to pursue holiness. He talks to Timothy about fighting the good fight. But make no mistake, it's going to be a what? A fight. Fight the good one. And then he challenges Timothy on a personal level at the very end when he talks about a word to the wealthy. Because he understood where Timothy had come from and where he was headed along the way. And so this little 6-chapter book, we're going to spend 7 weeks opening up these 6 chapters. Truth of the matter is, you could sit down and read it. I pray that you do. I pray that you read a chapter every week with us, but you could read all 6 chapters in about 30 minutes. But there is some really, really powerful stuff in this little 6-chapter book that Paul wrote to Timothy. And so I want to end today by giving you a couple of pictures of this, what I call kind of mentor-mentee, or this leader to student sort of relationship that Paul and Timothy had, because I think we can use some of it. I think we can take some of this stuff right out of the relationship and go put it right to use, whether it's in our family or whether it's at work tomorrow in the workplace. Paul did 3 really powerful things with Timothy, right? He made sure that Timothy, and these are all in the app already, so if you want to download the app, if you haven't, Josh is going to put some of these on the screens, but Paul made sure Timothy was the right guy for the job. Then he equipped Timothy for the job, and then he empowered Timothy for the job. Now, let's start with the first one. Paul made sure he was the right guy for the job. Paul did something that very few of us rarely do. Paul understood that his life and his ministry wasn't going to last forever. So he began to plan for his successor on the front end. He set out a set of credentials. What am I looking for the next person to come behind me? Most of the time for us at work, when do we start that process? Yeah, when the person puts in their 2-week notice. Right? And even then, we buy time for the first 10 days of it. And then 4 days in, we finally decide they are leaving. Paul says, listen, my life isn't lasting forever. So he makes a list. He's looking for some things, and he finds out, hey, Timothy, this guy is good. He's a man of great character, which was huge for him in terms of what he was looking for, but he also understood his dad was Greek. So is that going to be a problem? And he begins to try to discern. Hey, he's a man of good reputation. He has good character, and he had his list of character and chemistry and competence and calling. The things that he was looking for, when he saw Paul and he dove through them, he knew, or saw Timothy, he knew Timothy was the right guy for the job. I wonder for us how well we're doing in that seat. Right? How many of us have somebody ready to replace us along the way at work tomorrow? How many of us are starting to pour into a young Timothy in the office? And how many of us are scared to do that? Because the truth of the matter is Timothy's better than we are. So we want to keep pushing Timothy down. Maybe we're not in a place where the culture is like, hey, if I can rise Timothy up and he can take my job, I can go do something else. Maybe that scares us. Maybe we're worried Timothy just takes my job and I'm out. But are we prepping for the next person? I used to tell all the guys that work for me, my job, when I had an associate for my position, my job, I tell them straight up, my job is for you to take mine or take mine somewhere else. And if I do not do those two things, I have failed you. That's it. Are we planning a successor? Paul did that with Timothy. Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great, says it this way, right? You got to get the right person on the right bus and in the right seat. Right? Many times we get the right person on the right bus, they're in the wrong seat. Some people are on the bus and they're the wrong bus. But you say, you know what? We get the right people on the right bus and in the right seat, everyone wins. And then when you get them there, this is just free of charge. Do some things like this. Make sure the workload is manageable. How often do we get them in the right seat and then we work them like a pack mule? Especially in today's culture. We're buying into this idea, hey, if you won't do it, somebody else will. So they just keep throwing the work on. Oh, we'll pay for you a cell phone. Oh, great, that's awesome. Fantastic. Now you have to answer it 24 hours a day. And the text messages and the emails that come into it, and you never get to get away anymore. Make sure the workload is manageable, right? Reward and recognize great performance. You'll keep the right people when you do that. Ask them, by the way, how they want to be recognized. Some people don't want public thank you. It embarrasses them. They'll crawl in a hole and go the other way. So be sure you understand, but reward and recognize good behavior. Create a culture of community and family within your team, and then model respect. Model it. And make it an expectation of every area. When you find the right person and get them in the right bus and in the right seat, you want to keep them there. Right now, I also started to think about this from a family perspective. Now, Rita and I were laughing at lunch today because I was chewing this up. It hit me when I was going over it yesterday morning. I'm like, how does this work with family? She goes, well, they don't get to pick the bus. She goes, I got a couple of them we might want to get off the bus at a time. You know, I mean, we can't look at our kids and go, hey, you're on the wrong bus. You know, and they can't look at us and go, hey, you're the wrong bus. I need a new driver. You know, that part is there, but I do think sometimes we struggle with seats. Right? We play the power struggle sometimes. Right? Am I making decisions that they need to make? And when they make them, they're going to fail at them. So I take charge and I make them. And there is some struggle in there, making sure as parents, are we in the right seat? And can we keep each other in check a little bit along the way? Let's work through that process together. The second thing Paul did for Timothy, so he knew he was the right fit. The second thing Paul did is he went immediately into equipping Timothy. Right? So I got the right guy for the job. Let me start pouring into him. And Acts 17 tells us this beautiful story. There is absolutely nothing like on-the-job training, is there? You want to know how to do it? Come on, I'll show you. So he takes them into Berea, the city that they were in, and he and Silas and Timothy are all there. They start working in the church. The Jews come. They're agitated. The ruckus creates. What's Paul do? Hey, I'll see you guys in Athens. I'm out. And leaves Silas and Timothy sitting in Berea with the church that Paul came in to plant with all the angry people. Thanks, buddy. I appreciate it, but sometimes he recognized the ability was there. And sometimes there's absolutely nothing like on-the-job training, is there? Paul also, he saw Timothy and he goes, you have incredible potential, but there is something that's going to impact your ability to relate and minister to everyone down the road. And so part of my equipping process for you is going to be painful. He knew that Timothy's dad was Greek, which meant that he was a full-grown man and uncircumcised. And in the city of Lystra, that had no problem because they were an interracial community. He was able to minister there, no problem. But there were going to be many cities along the way that the entry point into the city for pastors is a synagogue, and as an uncircumcised man, he would not be allowed to enter. And so part of his equipping process for Timothy was painful. But he knew he had to prepare him to be able to relate to every audience that he would come across. And as leaders, our job is equipping the people that we work with and that work for us and work alongside us. And sometimes it's on-the-job training. Here, let me show you. Great, you got it? Okay, I'll be down the hall. Right? At least don't leave and go to another town and tell them you'll see him in a few months. Sometimes it's on the job. Sometimes that training can be painful as we carve away parts of our flesh or bad habits or those kinds of things along the way. But it's paramount that we equip them for the task. Same with our kids. And we've gone through several of these things recently. And Rita made the comment, we've been working to try to equip Sarah. Her transmission went out. Right? And so I live with a 17-year-old kid in a first world country that's had her own car since she turned 16, that goes to a school that's a pretty affluent school and thinks her 15-year-old car with 150,000 miles is a piece of junk and complains about it anyway. All fine until the piece of junk that's 15 years old with 150,000 miles on it doesn't run. Amazing how our perspective begins to change. So it needs a new transmission. I said, well, hey, great. When are you going to fix it? Dad, it's $1,300. Exactly. So it sat for 3 weeks. It's probably more inconvenient for us than it was for her, by the way. She's not in the room, so I can say that. But it sat for 3 weeks. But it's part of that equipping process to help her learn, to understand until she came, okay, so what's it going to take? Oh, that is a great question. I am so glad you asked. When you can bring this to the table, we'll do this. Well, how am I going to do that? I don't know. So it sits another week. Amazing how she figured out how to get this. But it's equipping her. If we just fix it for her, we have failed her. She needs to learn to be ready to experience the things that we will all experience in life. And Rita's comment was, this one is probably learning the most. Because she's sitting in the crow's nest watching. And seeing light bulbs start to come off. Now I know why you did that with Sarah. Now I know why some of those things. And we're blessed that she gets to live at home and see some of these things that we were just brutal parents for, that we're still being brutal parents with the other child, all of a sudden come into fruition, but it's part of the equipping process. And the last thing Paul did with him was he empowered him for success. Right? He gave him everything he needed along the way. He went right into town and he began to tell the people, this man is clearly called by God. Paul says he is a man who is pursuing a pure and holy heart after Jesus. Right? He announced to people in 2 Philippians, this guy's called. This is what he says. He talks to him in the son relationship. Again, Timothy has proven himself as a son. With his father, he has served with me in the work of the gospel. He began to empower him. And I read this week John Piper. He wrote a blog this week, and he said, I never realized as a young leader and a young pastor and a young dad that sitting down and modeling reading the Bible, what it was doing for the children and the people around me and my own family. Sometimes I think part of empowerment is showing them. And Paul did that. I love the story in Acts chapter 18 where Paul had been off in Corinth, and he comes back and he joins Silas and Timothy for ministry. And Paul says this in verse 5 in Acts 18. Paul devoted himself exclusively to teaching and testifying the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Timothy's passion, Timothy's empowerment was growing daily by seeing Paul model it for him. Right? Don't go do. Come watch. Let me show you. And as you learn from seeing the example, you are being more and more empowered. And Paul's clear to Timothy. He says, hey, the hardships are coming. And so he outlines for him 5 things that he continues to encourage him. He says, keep focused on the eternal reward. One day Jesus is coming back. That's where heaven is the reward for the long haul. So he says, when you have the hardship, remember the eternal reward. Remember the past promises. You promised to be a servant and a messenger of the gospel. You made that commitment. So when you endure hardship, remember your past promise. Remember the present promise of what he's doing in you right now and what you're seeing him do around you right now. And remember the future promise that he's one day coming back. And then don't forget, he says, God is sovereign. He is the King of Kings, and he is the Lord of Lords. He empowers him. And that's a challenge for us sometimes to empower people that we work for and lose control. Or sometimes it's difficult to empower our kids. This is, hey, we got to do the first 2 right. Make sure you got the right person in the right seat. Good chemistry, good culture. Equip them with everything they need to do. They got good competence. And then just remind them of the calling and turn them loose. And let them go chase what it is that you've set out. There's so much more that we could dive into in this relationship between Paul and Timothy, but I felt like it was important for us as we start reading through this to understand, hey, this is that relationship. These guys were special. And so as Paul writes to him, he writes from a heart of love. He writes from a heart of a dad, as well as a heart of a mentor and a leader. Right, as we see Timothy experience the brutality of being an adult who gets circumcised, it helps to understand, well, why did that have to happen? And it'll begin to put some pieces together to make sense. And my hope and my prayer, I want to challenge you is 2 things. Just ask yourself 2 questions. Who's my Paul? And who's my Timothy? And who is it that's pouring truth into you? Who is it that's bellying up to you that has the right and the authority and the voice to challenge us, to push us, to encourage us, to love us, to hold us accountable, and to push us all the way to the edge without breaking our spirit? Who's that person? And who's our Timothy? Who is it that we're willing to love unconditionally, to exhaust our own time and energy and resources and function so that one can come behind us, because our life with our children, our life with our career, our life in ministry isn't going to last forever. The death rate's 100%. Are we prepping for who comes next to where we can leave another Timothy who will raise another Timothy? Would you pray with me? And God, we just love you so, so much. We're thankful for your word in the scriptures and these 66 books that we're just so blessed with to read. God, your word gives us reminders of things just like this, the calling and the mission on our lives. And God, I thank you for so many servants who penned all these various letters that 2,000 years later, and we can read them and they can bring just greater clarity to our daily life today. So God, in a real and personal way, I thank you for the Pauls in my own life. God, for people who have intentionally poured your truth and your calling, and even at times held me accountable along the way. God, my prayer for your church here is that you would move us to have both Paul's and Timothy's in our lives. And move us to have someone who's speaking truth and guidance and challenging us and walking right alongside us, modeling for us what that looks like. And move us to have Timothy, to someone whom we're doing likewise. And God, I know both of those take work. And having somebody pour into us and empower us and equipping us and calling us to action sometimes is uncomfortable. But God, would you move us there anyway? And in the work it takes to sharpen someone else's sword, to be their equipper, their encourager, their empower, to model it for them, and to walk alongside them. God, to be honest, it's difficult and it's rarely convenient. And God, it's often consuming at times. But it's the model that you've left us with. So this morning, God, would you surround us together as a community? Surround us with opportunities to look and search and pray and discover the Pauls for us if we don't have one, and the Timothys. God, we just love you so much. In your precious name we pray. Amen. Well, next week we're going to dive into 1 Timothy, all of chapter 1. So if you have 5 minutes this week, somewhere along the way, to read through that, that'll kind of help you begin to get ready. As soon as we get broken down, we're going to head to Chester's, right there on the access road of 410 in Nacogdoches, have some lunch and a great time of community together. If you're new with us, it's your first time, we've got some cups for you out on the table. We'd love for you to take one of those. I'll be down front. Would love to say hello. Otherwise, have a blessed week.